Hello, everybody. Welcome to BeerSmith Podcast number 43. Got a great show for you today. We're going to talk a little bit about mead. I mentioned the last couple weeks, BeerSmithRecipes.com is now live. There's thousands of recipes there for you to look at, beer recipes, even a few mead recipes. Also, BeerSmith 2.1's out. And just a quick reminder, if you're interested, sign up for our newsletter, and we'll send you an article on beer brewing every week. And now, without further ado, let's jump right into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Michael Fairbrother from Moonlight Meadery in Londonderry, New Hampshire. His website's at moonlightmeadery.com. Michael tried his first mead in 1995 and started making mead at home. Since then, he's demonstrated an amazing skill for making international award-winning meads. He started Moonlight Meadery in 2010 and now makes mead professionally. Michael, it's fantastic to have you on the show.
Thanks, Brad. Great to be here.
I'm a big fan of your work, you know.
Yeah, I saw you just placed a nice order online. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I ordered a little bit of mead and had it shipped here, and I again, just fantastic stuff. I was just together with Michael and his wife, actually at the American Homebrewers Conference a short time ago, and sampled some of his mead again. Anyways, Michael, I was hoping you could jump in and talk a little bit about the history of meads.
Sure. So mead is the oldest fermented beverage, predates grape wine and beer. You can see cave paintings back 20,000 years ago, Neolithic time frame of man harvesting honey from beehives. And it's pretty straightforward. When you harvest honey from a beehive, it's pretty precious. Bees are pretty aggressive and don't really enjoy the fact that people are coming in to steal their honey. So you'd have this precious cargo, it'd get rained on or get some morning dew and start to dissolve and start to ferment. And you come back, let's say you were sleeping, you get up the next morning and you take a look at, this frothy mess and you're thinking, well, do I go fight the bees or do I drink the water off the top and get back to the honey? So they would drink the water off, get buzzed, and at that point, the rest is history. They start pushing the vats back out into the rain and getting more and more water on top of the honey to let it naturally ferment.
So, isn't that where the term honeymoon comes from too?
True. This is a myth or legend or lore, I guess, all the above. But the original meaning of the word honeymoon was to give a newly married couple enough mead to last their first month of marriage, so that they could enjoy their fertility and happiness.
So, Michael, a lot of people get confused by all different types of mead. What are some of the variants of mead? I know there's all kinds of. What are their technical terms?
So there's roughly 3 or 4 different varieties of mead that I can cover for you today. Traditional mead, which is a mead that's made from just honey. Mm-hmm. You can use different types of honey, whether it's wildflower, orange blossom, tupelo blossom. So the honey is the flavor characteristic that really defines a traditional mead. That you can have a meads with fruit, which is a melomel. Of the melomel styles, you can have whole bunches of different types of fruits. I've used strawberries, blueberries, combinations of fruits. You can make ones with apples, which becomes a sizer. And then there's also piments, which are meads that are made from grapes. And again, everything matters, so that all changes the flavor profile. And then the other style of mead that we make quite a bit of here at my meadery is methaglens. And methaglen is a mead made with spices. Now, traditionally, I would add the spices in secondary, not in primary. Mm-hmm. And the reason you do that is so that you get a nice, clean spice, aroma, and flavor. If you add the spice in primary, you'll strip out all the aromatic components during the fermentation phase.
So now you started as a home brewer, and actually you didn't go pro till about 2010, I think, right? Is that right?
Right, that's right.
About the same time I did. Remember,
it's fun, isn't it?
Yeah, we had lunch together a couple of years ago, and we're discussing this. But anyways, you started as a home brewer, so you started, I assume, making 5-gallon recipes or something like that, right?
Yeah, the first mead I ever tried was back in 1995, and I was at a homebrew party that was a combination between the Boston Wort Processors and the homebrew club I belong to, which is Brew Free or Die. And the typical thing that happens at these homebrew meetings is they share samples. and I got to taste. Somebody asked me if I want to try a sizer, and I had no idea what I was being offered, but I said sure. And then I was asked, well, when I took a sip of it, you ever see a baby try something for the first time and they try it and they light right up and their expression is like, oh, this is great. Well, I was 29 and I had that kind of reaction. And I immediately went home and determined to figure out how to make some mead. And while I still kept brewing beer, I just got better and better at making mead. And by 2006, I noticed that when I brought bottles of mead to homebrew club parties, usually the women in the room were knocking their husbands and boyfriends over to get to me to drink mead instead of drinking the beer. So I was like, okay, target audience is going to be women. And the rest is history. But I made, in 1 year, 60 different single-source varietal honey meads. Wow. So a single-source varietal honey means the majority of the flavor, the pollen, comes from one type of flower. Mm-hmm. And how a beekeeper can do that is that they bring the hive to the field while the field's in bloom, and then when the field's no longer in bloom, they harvest the honey from the beehive.
Okay, so let's say somebody wants to start out with 5 gallons of mead, just a simple mead, and mm-hmm. How would you recommend they start? What would that look like? What would the recipe look like?
Yeah, for me, I usually build everything based on ratios. So a ratio is 25% honey, 75% water. That'll get you a pretty semi-sweet to sweet mead, depending on the yeast that you use.
So you're talking about how many for, say, 5 gallons? How many pounds?
You're looking at about a gallon and a half, which is 18 pounds of honey.
18 pounds of honey. Okay. And then, I mean, you're literally, a lot, obviously.
Yeah, that's a lot of honey. So in honey, wholesale is around $2 a pound. I know I just bought some Tupelo Blossom honey, which is going to be really hard for folks to get a hold of this year. That cost me close to $5 a pound this year.
Wow. So pretty, yeah. But I mean, you're working at strengths very close to wine, right? Essentially, you're working in the 12, 13%.
Yeah, I push the
range.
upper limit. I go from... The weakest meads we make are about 12%, and we go up towards 18. So I'm really starting off at like 1130 up to 1150 starting points.
Okay.
And you can make them quite a bit drier than that, or quite a bit non-alcoholic. But the question is, what do people like? And I find that if you can create a good mead, a mead that doesn't have the high fusel alcohol notes, mm-hmm. is nice and clean and doesn't taste like it has 17% alcohol, then you've really got a winner on your hands. Mm-hmm. And I've won Mead Maker 3 years straight here in New England at the New England Regional Homebrew Competition before I started this company.
Now, so let's say I go out and purchase, well, let's start at the very beginning. I guess you don't necessarily purchase honey right off the shelf, right? You don't go to the supermarket and buy 18 pounds of honey.
No, that would be definitely cost foolish.
So where do you go out to get honey to brew with?
You want to contact your local apiaries, the local Beekeepers Association. You want to talk to them about buying, a gallon and a half or two. There are wholesale suppliers like Pennsylvania Dutch Gold. That's the company that owns the company we buy our honey from. Mm-hmm. It's the largest honey supplier on the eastern seaboard. Ken Schramm's book mentions a lot of good beekeeping sources, but you can go to the Honey Locator website. The National Honey Board keeps a website or a database of all the large-scale honey producers all over the country, if not the world. So you can search by honey type, and then you can find who has that type of honey you're looking for.
And I know some of the larger homebrewer shops offer it as well, don't they?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah. I've used to buy a lot of honey that way as well. But here in New England, we have a lot of local beekeepers, and they're easy to find. There's probably 5 or 6 in a given 20-mile radius.
So let's say I get my 18 pounds of honey, and I get water. Now what do I do? So how do I actually go about making mead? Yeah,
the style that I use to make mead is to not heat the honey. So honey contains a lot of natural enzymes and a lot of natural wild yeast. But the key is that you want to capitalize on that natural honey flavor. If you cook the honey, you bake a lot of that aromatics out, and the flavor changes quite a bit. So we do a no-heat method, and we use staggered yeast nutrients. So Kurt Stock gave a talk, and I can't even remember how long ago it was, but it's the first time I learned about staggered yeast nutrients. And literally overnight, it changed my style of mead making. So nutrients, honey does not have all the nitrogen like malt would have in a
Right.
beer, or that grape wine would have. So your honey is really nitrogen light, or so you want to add, and I use Go Firm and DAP, which is, I can't even pronounce the bloody name of the stuff, but it's dimethylide phosphate or something like it. It's basically nitrogen. So in a 5-gallon batch, you're going to use 3 teaspoons, and you're going to split that across 4 additions. So the first addition goes in...
3 teaspoons of each, or?
No. So 1 teaspoon of Fermaid K, 2 teaspoons of DAP.
Okay. You can probably get those at your local shop.
Yeah, every homebrew shop has those, or you can get them online. But most places, they'll have what they'll call a yeast blend or a yeast nutrient package.
Mm-hmm. So you take those 2 additives, which is 3 teaspoons altogether. That's 2 of one,
Yep.
2 of the DAP, and 1 of the other one. And you split them into 4 pieces. Is that right?
Yeah, you blend them together, and then you add 3/4 of a teaspoon first day, second day, third day, and the last one goes in when sugar completion is 2/3 of the way done. So when your starting gravity has dropped down, then you can add the last one. Typically, you got to measure the gravity to find out exactly when that's going to be, but my rule of thumb is about a week to 2 weeks in, you're adding the 3rd addition. And what that'll give you is a very nice, rigorous fermentation. And we also rehydrate all our yeast, and we pitch our yeast at 1 gram dry per gallon. So in a 500-gallon vat that we make, we're adding 500 grams of yeast that we rehydrate and follow the rehydration protocol that's specified by the yeast manufacturer.
Well, since you're on the topic of yeast, you probably don't use your standard brewer's yeast here. What kind of yeast are you using to make mead?
I use exclusively in the winery today Lavalin 71B, which is a white wine yeast. It's rated to 14% alcohol, but that just means that's where it typically ferments to. Mm-hmm. With proper care and feeding and temperature control and oxygen, you can get that to go up to 18% without really much challenges. So we ferment at a very cool temperature, considering for what most ales or lagers ferment, or not lagers, but we ferment at 62 degrees, and we allow only a 4-degree gain in temperature during that time frame. If you think of a 50-gallon vat of mead, and that's probably a lot bigger than most of your listeners might be making, but that's our smallest size these days. You can see about a 7-degree gain in temperature from ambient, and that 7-degree gain causes the yeast to go into a cycle where it's fermenting faster and faster, and when it ferments faster, you get all the fusel alcohols and the hot, spicy notes that I don't find.
So what temperature would you recommend if you have cool basement or something like that to work with?
You want the mid-60s.
Mid-60s, okay.
Yeah, 5-gallon vat size, you should be okay in the mid-60s, even up to 68 temperature. But you get above 72, and it's going to go into this cycle where the faster it ferments, the more heat it generates. The more heat it generates, the faster it ferments, and next thing you know, you've got rocket fuel. So
you want to pick a nice cool spot in the house and maybe wrap it with some wet towels or something to keep that temperature down then, huh?
Yeah, depending on where you live, I guess. Here in New England, we've got pretty cool basements, and it's great for that. I used to make a lot of mead during the summertime here. In my winery, if it's not temperature controlled, we're not actively fermenting. At this time of year, we keep that for secondary fermentation.
Now, I know at one time it took years to make mead.
Yeah, my first few batches took, the very first batch of mead I ever made was, so I tasted the Sizer, and a Sizer is a mead made with apples, and I'm thinking to myself, well, I love apple, but I love pineapple even more, so let me go home and make a pineapple mead. So I got some chunked pineapple juice, and honey, and I mixed this stuff together, and I threw it into the fermenter. Well, don't try this at home, because the chunk of pineapple blocked up the airlock and splat all over the ceiling.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it was quite the quite the mess. And then what happened was, so it fermented, made it in July. It took probably till September before I was ready to rack it and put it into a keg. And the acidity level from the pineapple was off the charts. I mean, it was undrinkable. It was horrible. And I'm sitting there looking at it, and tasting, and I'm thinking, this is my mead making journey. This is step one. And all the books I had read at that time had suggested you let it age, and it takes forever to make mead.
Yeah.
So I put it in a keg and put it down in the basement and forgot about it. So I'm a pretty prolific home brewer, and I used to make 20-gallon batches at a time. So kegs of beer and cider and mead were all over the place. And it was about 5 years later that I got to try the pineapple mead. I had a meeting at the house for Brew for Your Die, and a good friend, who's now a good friend I just met that day, said, "Hey, I hear you make great mead." I'm like, "Oh, you got to try this stuff." And so I'd gone down to the basement with like a pitcher, and I was trying to dig up where the pineapple mead was, because I knew it was at least 5 years old at this point, and I wanted to try it. And he took one sip, and he literally said, "Oh my God, this is the best stuff I've ever had."
Wow.
And so yeah, my traditional style mead making techniques up until I learned about staggered yeast nutrients was a year to two, 3 to 4, easy. And once I went to staggered yeast nutrients, right around 3 months, I could pull it out of the fermenter, enter it into a competition,
Wow.
and I won Best of Show doing that with the mead that you just purchased the other day.
So if you start with, so you start by literally just mixing water and honey, right?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
You're gonna toss in the yeast nutrients, and then
Yep.
and then what's the next step? Then how do you help shorten this time frame? Obviously, the staggered yeast nutrients help, but
Yeah, so why staggering the nutrients, and here's what it's doing for you. So the yeast is doubling in population density every 24 hours, and that doubling, you're trying to give the new batch of yeast the same nutrients so it can do its job that you gave the previous batch. So by staggering the nutrients, you're giving the whole colony enough nutrients to do what you want them to do and do well. So without stressing the yeast, they'll actually ferment and do a great job. Now you have a couple of choices. One, you can mix the yeast and the honey and the water all together, or dissolve the honey into the water first and then pitch the yeast onto it. Another technique that I've done is to simply add the honey, add some warm water on top of the honey, and add the yeast and let the yeast gradually chew up the honey over the course of a couple-week period. So it's self-feeding itself as it continues to boil, or not boil, but ferment. It is... it basically consumes the honey, and I've marked it and watched it go from a 1/16 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch to a 1/4 inch over a couple day period, where, it's pretty cool to see how the honey can go down, and it's probably make a good experiment for a bunch of homebrewers to try this from all over to see and record the results a little more scientifically than I did in my basement.
okay. So we go through that process. You're adding staggered yeast nutrients. You mentioned the first 3 days in particular, right?
Yep.
What's the next step after that? Do you just let it sit?
So you can degas your meads, which
Yeah, I've heard of people using a paint stirrer or something like that.
You want to be careful. So as mead is fermenting, the CO2 is toxic to the yeast, and so you want to get that CO2 out of solution. And unlike beer, mead or wine loves oxygen, so you can add more oxygen to the process by stirring it up during the fermentation cycle. However, caution should be mentioned, and also rehydrate your nutrients before you add them to your must. Otherwise, it's going to create a nucleation spot, and all your mead's going to come up and out of the fermenter.
So take the nutrients and what? Mix them with some warm water?
Yes, some sterile water would be great, just as long as they're wet, and add them very gradually.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you from firsthand experience, when adding nutrients to a 500-gallon vat, you do not want to do this quickly, and I've seen it jump 2 feet and come up over the edge. And when you're on top of a ladder looking down into a 12-foot tall fermenter, that's pretty scary.
Okay, so how do you go through the aeration process, though? How do you degas it and add more air?
The best way to do this is probably to ferment in a 5-gallon or a 7-gallon plastic bucket, so you can take the lid off. And then you want to use a sterilized whisk, and so you gradually stir it up. And then you, once it's stirred up, by stirring it, you're adding the oxygen, you're removing the CO2, and that gives you a much better way to do that. If you're going to try to do it in a carboy, you really, really want to be careful. So if you're going to take one of those little paint whips or mixing wands, you want to go extremely slow to start with, and because it's going to gas out and then continue to gas out. Yeah, it froths really fast, and I cannot tell you how fast it can go. But I can tell you, when I've seen somebody try to do this in a 55-gallon drum, the geyser of mead was coming out the top of it was 4 feet high, and he's trying to put his hands down to prevent it from coming out. But we have a bath of mead here, where this is how we learn sometimes.
Okay, so let's say we go through that process. How long do you degas or aerate? How many days do you continue doing that?
You want to probably do that the first 4 or 5 days. You don't need to go much beyond that. And once you're at the third way through sugar depletion, you want to stop doing that at that point.
Okay.
So when you get to that final addition of nutrients, you're done. You basically don't want to touch it at this point until it's become clear. You can rack it to a secondary or tertiary to avoid having it sit on the lees. But I've never seen a problem. I've had mead sit on yeast for 3 years and not cause any off flavors.
So after those first couple days, you really don't worry about anything except that last, I guess, you mentioned the last nutrient addition, which you add, 2/3 of the way through, I guess?
Right.
And then at that point, it's just a matter of letting it clear, right? You don't have to worry about moving to a secondary or tertiary or any of the things we do for beer brewing.
Yeah, you don't have to do anything at that point. You can let it sit out. When I do my fruit meads, all the fruit goes in primary fermentation. No spices go in primary, so all my fruit additions are up front, so you get a nice clear flavor.
That was another question I had is, if you are making a fruit mead, when in the process do you add that?
Yeah, the easiest way to do it is right at the beginning. So if you're going to use whole fruit, freeze it first so that it helps break down the membranes, especially if you use
breaks up the cells, right?
Yeah, strawberries or blueberries or raspberries or any of those kind of fruits. Also, you can make really tasty mead with some of the organic fruit juices that you can buy in the local grocery store. Mm-hmm. Just Fruit is one of the ones that I used to use when I first started, and I can remember driving in a 10-mile square radius, clearing out all the stores of the fruit juice they had so I could start production.
So, I mean, do you have any other recommendations on how much fruit do you add? Let's say you're making...
That's a great question. So
it is, yeah.
It's a complicated question, too. So if you want a light fruit note, you want to go 1 to 1.5 pounds per gallon. If you want a pretty intense... like what I make commercially, you're going around 4.5 to 5 pounds per gallon. And I can tell you the honey will support the fruit. And so I like a really, really big type of a fruit flavor in the mead. Usually, especially when you're judging competitions and somebody declares they've got black currants, blueberries, or black raspberries, you want to be able to taste each one of them. Mm-hmm. And it's often really hard if you're going with a really light combination or the fruits are very subtle. I mean, raspberries aren't so subtle, but strawberries, for example.
Strawberries are very subtle.
Really subtle. We judged, I was at the table where the Best of Show mead was being judged, well, before it became the Best of Show, but, and Gordon Strong asked me to take a sip of it, and I tasted it, and it was absolutely delicious. The strawberry was over the top. Perfect. I mean, it tasted like fresh strawberry pie. Wow. And I just couldn't imagine how somebody could get that beautiful flavor and aroma into the mead. I know personally it's rather challenging, so that must be a pretty high fruit ratio.
So, I mean, that's another question, though, is what fruits do you recommend to use with mead? Obviously, some come through much stronger than others, and other ones tend to fade.
Yeah, I can only think of one fruit that I would never want to try in a mead, and that's watermelon. And somebody actually handed me a watermelon mead this last week in Seattle to say, hey, see, try it. And my opinion was the same as where it was before. So it really depends on you, the mead maker, what fruits you like. I've tried pineapple. I can tell you pineapple takes a long time. The acidity level's really kind of creepy. So you have to learn either how to adjust pH, or to live with it and let it go for a long period of time. I cannot stress the point enough. If you do not like how your mead tastes today, wait. It will improve with time. I actually made a coffee mead. In 2009, I was at the Craft Brewers Convention, and they were giving away coffee extract or concentrate. And I said, and Lay's like, well, I don't know what you can make with it. And I'm like, oh, let me try a mead. And so that was in April. By June, I took a sip of it, and I was extremely disappointed. It tasted horrible. I'm thinking this is going to be something I'm going to have to blend into a stout, but it's not going to work. By September, I took another taste and I was really impressed. And so I brought some to the Brew for a Die meeting. And we have a couple we have a Grandmaster 2-level judge here, Dan Hall. And he took a sip and he's like, Michael, this is incredible. He says, you really got a great flavor with this. And that mead went on to win the gold in the category at the New England Regional Homebrew Competition, but it also won 2 medals at the Mazer Cup 2 years in a row. So the coffee flavors can take a while to get to a perfect balance. I've been tweaking and playing around with how to use different types of coffee in the meads we make. We're now doing a cold filtered. So we basically grind the coffee grains coarse, add them right into the must, and when it in secondary, and when it tastes finished, we rack it off the coffee grounds, and it's so much smoother and softer, not as bitter. And because we're getting some comments from a couple of our customers that love the coffee notes, but just not enough. We now have plenty, so it should be good.
So, let's take a couple of your signature meads. I mean, you've got, I had an apple pie mead the other day. It was fantastic. How do you make something like an apple pie mead? Just rough idea. You don't have to give away your secret recipe here, but
the recipe is pretty straightforward. So instead of using water, we dilute the honey with apple cider, and by doing that, you've got 75% cider, 25% honey.
Wow!
You're going to have a really, really strong mead, which is pushing 1151 starting gravity points, and it really ferments beautiful.
That's a lot of. I assume you're using like natural cider or something.
Yeah, I get it right from the local farms. We're surrounded here in Londonderry by apple farms.
Right.
And our first year, I thought I made plenty, and we sold out by, I think it was April, and by October, or the following October, we sold 200 cases in one day when we released the batch because of the demand was so high for it.
So, I mean, it's literally just apple cider though, and honey, or I assume you use you spice it with cinnamon or something like that.
We and here's the recommendation for your spices: use the best you can buy. We use Madagascar bourbon vanilla beans. You don't have to scrape them. You don't have to cut them in half. You just toss them in whole, and then we use Vietnamese cinnamon, and it's usually in a ground up format, and it has a beautiful. It's a night and day flavor difference between what you consider store-bought cinnamon. I guess the commercial name for it in the stores is like Saigon cinnamon, which is really from a cinnamon tree, where the other stuff's not quite from a cinnamon tree. That's some sort of offshoot or different, cheaper tree that they can grow. But the difference is night and day. And so with the vanilla and the cinnamon, with the apple and the honey, it literally tastes like apple pie.
Wow.
And that's the comment I hear the most is when people are trying it, they say, wow. I mean, I counted, we were doing a tasting the other night, probably 50 people said wow as they tasted my product. So it's nice. And that's the biggest challenge I have, which is getting people to understand that not all mead tastes the same and that the flavors can be all over the place from dry to semi-sweet to sweet.
And one of my other favorites was, I think it's currants and cherries in it. How do you do something like that? I mean, it's what's great about this particular mead that I'm thinking of. And can you remember the name of it? Can you tell me it was?
It's Desire.
Desire. Okay. So,
Desire.
anyways, what I love about it is it has so many levels of flavor to it. It's like, you have a taste of it and there's there's just layer upon layer upon layer of different flavors you get out of it.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. So we use 3 different types of fruit. So it's black currants, blueberries, black cherries. I make lots of meads with currants. Currants are one of my favorite fruits to use in a mead. We make some with just black.
What does a currant add? Because a lot of people aren't familiar with currants.
So currants, it's also known as cassis. So if you've ever had like a Kir Royale, which is cassis, which is a type of blackcurrant liqueur, and champagne, that's a very common drink for like a digestif or aperitif in like French restaurants. It's a really tart, pungent, black blueberry type of flavor. Red currants are quite a bit softer, not as tart, but the flavors are unmistakable. I mean, I like to play with red and black currants. I do a lot with blueberries and cherries. For cherries, we use sour cherry or black cherry to get a flavor. I haven't made a lot with sweet cherry, looking really to balance the perception of the sweetness with the currants. So you can have a really sweet mead, but the perception can be quite dry if the currants are balanced appropriately. So we use, in my current mead, it's basically, well, I make so many. Embrace, which is just black currants, is bone dry. There's not a lick of sweetness left in it. So it's got like 1 degree residual sugar, and it's puckering. It's almost like a Sour Patch Kid. It gets you right in the back of the throat, and it's just tart. But Desire is kind of in the middle of the road for sweetness. It's a semi-sweet because of the currants and the cherries.
Still fairly sweet overall, though, I think. Yeah,
it's got an overall finish, but what's wonderful about mead and meads that we make is they really pair with food. So think of how many chefs can work honey into a recipe. So that honey is a natural affinity to many different flavors. So I've actually enjoyed my Desire, which is the blackcurrant blueberry black cherry mead, 16.8 ABV with like duck confit, prime rib, dark chocolate, cheese. I mean, it spans the spectrum. And that one won Best of Show at the this competition of 353 entries. And that's why I started the company. We sell it 4-to-1 over everything else we make.
Wow. I know your wife did a session in Seattle on food pairings with mead.
Yes.
And unfortunately I didn't make it, but I heard it was absolutely fantastic. I was wondering if you could just talk for a minute about food pairings and what, what goes with what.
I think, they talk about the flavonoids of fruit and food, and with beer being better than wine because beer has much more complex flavonoids than wine does. But with honey wines, you've got all the complexity back. So, I mean, literally the sky's the limit. So we can, like my coffee in bed goes amazing with German chocolate cake or tiramisu. We've got a dry blackcurrant mead that can work well with like a triple cream brie, venison. Smitten was my peach mead. We had it with a cheddar cheese. So it was a dry peach with the cheddar, really brought out the crystallized notes of the cheddar cheese. But then when you switched it up, the same cheese with Kurt's apple pie, which is our apple pie mead.
Apple pie mead, yeah.
Yeah, and Kurt's my lifetime best friend, so he's the originator of the recipe, and and it just brings it. It's like a New England apple pie with a slice of cheddar on the top, and it just, I mean, the cheese and the mead just go so well together.
Fantastic. Well, I wanted to actually ask you just to take a few minutes to talk about your jump to full time and your new experiment with Moonlight Meadery. I know it's been almost 2 years. Well, a little over 2 years now, right?
Yeah, we started my garage, and my garage is about 400 square feet, and that was in May of 2010. Now, you have to understand, my neighbors had an absolute meltdown when I was going to start the winery, because I started the paperwork back in December after winning the Best of Show and Mead Maker of the Year. And so I invited my neighbors to my house to see where we were going to set up shop and answer any questions, and they said they were good. They said no problems, and so I was still nervous to go in front of the town to ask for a variance on my garage because my house is in what's considered agricultural/residential.
Right.
Well, wine is an agricultural business, so I could start the business. So I just needed a variance to start it, and we're going to be up and running. So I went into the local town, sat down at the meeting, and I was pretty nervous. And then I see my neighbors coming in. I'm like, oh, they're here to support me. I get up to go say thanks and welcome. And the first lady in line said, it's not personal. Well, I felt like my heart got ripped out of my chest because here they came to my house to talk to me, and I asked them to come back if they had any questions. And here they were out to sandbag my operation. Yeah. And, so I gave my presentation to the town, and I was a complete wreck. I'm a pretty shy guy. I don't like to talk too much about in public, or at least I didn't. I can talk really well about my business nowadays. So I told him about everything, and my neighbor raised his hand. He said, well, what's he going to do with all the spent grain? I raised my hand, and I said, I don't know what kind of honey he eats, but there's no grain in the honey that I use.
Exactly.
And then they were concerned about the noise from the airlocks, and again, I raised my hand.
Noise from the airlocks.
And I said, the closest neighbor is 600 feet away, and I sleep right above my garage. There's no way it's going to keep me up at night. And so the town gave me unanimous approval, and it took till May to get my federal and state licenses. And when we started, I grabbed a bottle, similar to this one, and the town or the state inspector came in and saw it, and he said basically that you're never going to sell a bottle. It's too small. It's too much money. People don't like honey wines, and you're just going to waste all this time. And I looked at him and I said, well, you've never tried what I make, so how would you know? And we sold an awful lot of product. I think we were coming up on close to 75,000 bottles sold in our first 2 years in production. And we expect to sell almost 100,000 bottles just this year alone.
Wow.
So
and you said you make how many varieties? It was
58.
58 varieties.
I'm always playing around trying to come up with new flavors and to see what else I want to play with and what we like. We made... well, let me get back to the story. So,
yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
In May, we started production, and by July, my first account, it came on. That's Better Beers up here in Hooksett, New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. He's got a great store, and he's always going to be my first account. And he bought out everything I had. And so by July 7th, I quit my day job and went full time with the company. By September, we couldn't fit my garage anymore, and we needed to find a commercial space to get some bigger tanks. And we took over a 2,000 square foot warehouse space. It took till November to get it opened up for the showroom. We really wanted to have a very attractive place. When I determined early in my homebrewing career that women love the mead, and 81%, it turns out, of my customers are women. So we really wanted to focus on having that great product and great quality and a great showroom. Then January of 2011, I'd hired Bernice on full time, and she runs my VP of Sales and Marketing, and she's not quite my wife yet. Coming up in August, we're getting married. And we're actually making a mead for our wedding called Jetem, which is a sparkling Tupelo blossom mead. And so she was employee 1. By May, I'd hired my first, by April, we became the first winery in New Hampshire state history to ever be distributed to California. Wow. And I can tell you tears were streaming down my face when I saw my product up in Napa Valley all the way down to San Diego, and to see my product on Stone World Bistro's bottle list, literally, to this day, just gives me shivers to think about, seeing my Moonlight Meadery next to Mickler on a list like that is still something I'm really, really proud of. And by May, I'd hired my second employee. Now I've got close to 10 employees, full-time and part-time. We're sold in 7 states, distributing to 17. We just shipped our first case order to Australia. I've got another case order I'm working on putting together for Australia. And I hope today, and I say this with hope today because I've been dealing with lawyers on this topic for the last 4 months, can announce that we're going to have a nationwide distribution deal signed.
Wow, fantastic. What a success. And then all that growth in 2 years.
Yeah, we grew from 2011 over 2010 by 760%, and this year over last year we're already up 300%. So we're just gangbusters. We now have a 4,000 square foot facility. Our smallest batch size is 60 gallons. Our biggest batch size right now is 500, but we are looking at 3,000 gallon fermenters or 100 barrel fermenters. Wow!
I mean, you literally started in your garage too, which is a great story.
Thank you.
Well, Michael, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Follow your passion. Don't let people tell you what you can and can't make. You're your own best judge. How you evaluate the flavor of the mead and what you like, make it for yourself. That's why I'll never make a mead that I don't want to drink. I figure if I can't sell it, then I'm stuck drinking it, and I might as well make stuff that I enjoy. So, we make an awful lot of different varieties, basically because I like variety.
Well, thank you, Michael. I really appreciate you being on the show.
Oh, Brad, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks again.
And enjoy that desire that's coming to your way.
Yeah. I ordered a case myself, and I have to say, Michael, I have never ordered a case of wine, period, ever in my life. But mead, you pushed me over the edge, so I finally did it. So nice. Thank you for that. So again, my guest today was Michael Fairbrother from Moonlight Meadery in Londonderry, New Hampshire. His website again is moonlightmeadery.com. Well, a big thank you to Michael Fairbrother from Moonlight Meadery for doing that great interview. A reminder, sign up for a free account at beersmithrecipes.com and also sign up for our newsletter at beersmith.com. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.